Welcome to the Play Typer Guide podcast. I'm Stephen Robinson. Joining me is Evan Barker, author of Nothing Left, Confessions of a Democratic Operative. Well, first off, congratulations on your book, Evan, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
Glenn Greenwald, the journalist, had written, Evan Barker courageously blows the whistle on a Democratic Party that has betrayed its defining values. Nothing Left is a vital insider's account of what went wrong. So both followers of this podcast and subscribers are perhaps going to get upset about a lot of what you wrote. I do think it's important that they actually read it, but I know there's been a lot of backlash. Things that we'll get into is sort of like a general sense of, oh, this person was a Democrat who just went MAGA, and which is obviously not exactly what happened. But
a little bit more nuance. Yeah.
Well, nuance is difficult, and we'll kind of get into this. My sense has been like, these dialogues are important in the party, and if anyone's leaving your party, you should figure out what is happening. Right. But I think there's a sense of, I hate to use this term. I will be sort of stating for many things, it does seem, I don't want to say cult-like, but sort of evangelical, right? Like you've committed heresies, you're out of it. So the one thing I'd like to start off with, because you've written about this, but Damon Linker online, folks are familiar with him, but he had posted something similar to what you had said, but I thought I would jump off on this, which is Democrats had 60 seats in the Senate less than 2 decades ago. That seems impossible now because the party moved sharply left on cultural issues, including immigration, race, gender, crime, etc. And you've made similar arguments specifically related to sort of the progressive wing of the party. But,
how they influence the establishment, which they did.
I would argue that it's a sort of, even beyond that influence, sort of a party-wide issue of trying to address kind of the losing ground in those areas, specifically with material benefits. So right. Whether it's universal health care or something more let's say more centrist from the centrist wing, it's usually good governance will solve these issues that we're having in these states, and we don't have to moderate on anything else.
Right.
And usually the response from the party, and again, across all ideological wings, is that you're trying to sell out marginalized, vulnerable people. Obviously, I don't want to as part of the marginalized, vulnerable people, but obviously something has happened. Obviously, this is not sustainable for Democrats to have essentially a ceiling of about 51 Senate seats. What do you say to people who says it's like, well, we can't
throw those people under the bus.
Yeah.
It's like, I would counter with them and I would ask, well, do you think that Barack Obama in 2008 was throwing anybody under the bus that was marginalized? I don't think so at all. And I think that, his social and cultural views today would not be welcome as much in the Democratic Party. And so I think that I think the Democrats, even if they don't agree with what I'm saying, even if they think that, trans athletes should be allowed to compete in women's sports, whatever, like at the end of the day, or even if they think anybody should be able to come here, even if they're not coming here legally, and just get benefits, after they come here, like in California, for instance, anybody that, at least it was this way for a couple of years. I think they actually stopped doing this because they realized how expensive it was and they started running out of money. But anybody that came to California on a tourist visa could get Medicaid, which is just like insane to me. And obviously that didn't work out very well. Those people, though, that did apply during that window are still grandfathered into the system. That's still costing California a lot of money. But I would just say, like, clearly you are losing coalitions. And so you can either confront this stuff now or you can just let it keep continuing. And I think what they don't realize is that it really erodes their common sense on a lot of fundamental issues where they actually do have authority. like on healthcare, for instance. That's one of the arguments I make in my book, is that, even after the 2024 election, there was one issue that Democrats still had more trust with the general public on, one high value issue, and that was healthcare, than Republicans. But they erode their own trust on all issues by continuing to take the 80 side of 80, or continuing to take the 20 side of 80-20 issues. And I think that there are some Democrats that recognize that this is an issue, and they are more open to having conversations about it. Probably many of the people that are listening to the show right now feel that way, but they don't feel like they can necessarily talk about it. And I just think that you can't just ignore these issues. I think for them, maybe the solution is we just go hard to the left on economics, and maybe we just stop talking about the social and culture issues as much, although obviously not all Democrats are doing that. And it'll just work itself out. But I think the problem with that frame of thinking is that the Republican Party is not going to let them get away without confronting these issues.
Mm-hmm.
We'll look at James Tallarico right now in Texas. Polls are showing he's close. I don't think he's going to win in November. I would be very surprised if he did. But they've got a whole treasure trove of opposition on him, with him saying just these ridiculous things during Woke One, saying that God is non-binary, just all of these crazy statements that they're playing on repeat right now. And so I think you either let the Republicans define your future, or you define your future. And clearly, and I'll make this final point, Joe Biden, to his credit, and I put this in my book, recognized that part of the reason that Donald Trump won in 2016 is because he tapped into the people in this country, especially in the Rust Belt, the middle of the country, who feel left behind and feel like their jobs were taken away because they were, and their towns hollowed out because they were. And he made a big industrial investment into manufacturing into this country and brought tons of jobs back to parts of, this country that have been hollowed out. And still, even though he did that, in 2024, 4 years later, the working class of this country still rejected him. They still rejected the Democratic Party. And so you can't just assume that going left on economic issues will be the only thing that it takes to win back these people. Culture and social issues are very important to working class people too.
One challenge to that would be that Biden was hit by he actually went too far left as far as on economics, as far as
well, he did on some things, yes, so student loans are a great example,
which might have led to the perception of high inflation, and of course immigration were the two worst issues for him. And there's arguments, of course, this was a global issue, but specifically in Americans felt like the economy was not going well. And so the argument has been that, well, the same position on social issues, but with a better economy, Biden doesn't have to drop out. Biden can win. And you can't prove that, obviously, right? But that's a view.
Well, I think that kind of feeds into another issue, is that the Democratic Party, and especially the younger people in the Democratic Party and the staffer class specifically, think that policies like wiping student loan debt is going to help them win over working class people. But in reality, I know, but they really do. I know it's funny to you and it's funny to me, but they think that this is a working class policy. Mm-hmm. And that kind of goes into what we're going to talk about later, which is the issues with the staffer class. But it actually is just a giveaway to the Democrats' new base, which is overly educated, downwardly mobile, college-educated people.
I had warned about this at the time, and I was at a different publication, and everyone, of course, was
mad at you.
I was like freaking out and saying, no, this is wonderful. It's great that he's doing this, but this is Schumer was posting it, Warren was posting it. We got to forgive student loan debt. And my sense was like, well, this is not going to play well with working class people who either didn't go to college or who went to a different type of college specifically so they wouldn't get into
Or didn't go
so
to
much
college.
debt.
Yeah.
And so there's all these issues. And, I would, there were economic arguments for why that would be potentially a good thing to do. But I would say, like, well, you can't do that and then say that Bidenomics is booming. So to me, it's
Right.
like, if you're sort of doing that, you need to do it with sort of like, oh, I need to kind of bail out everyone. So it's sort of like treat it sort of like a stimulus for everyone. But it wound up being this weird thing of like, the economy's doing great, but it's also sort of doing so bad that I need to forgive loans that people willingly took. I could say that, oh, sure, that's maybe it's a good policy to forgive student loans. I'm just pointing out the political reality of how it hits, but
Yeah.
often pointing out the political reality of things is often interpreted as speaking heresy. So no
Yeah.
one will kind of listen. You had talked about Tallarico. That was interesting to me because it was a very heated primary between him and Jasmine Crockett. And when all the debates about electability, often it seemed to come down to, well, and I don't necessarily disagree with this, that Tallarico might win over some white college again, always college educated, some more of the white college educated voters in Texas, because he is, again, all vibes, right? He will present as kind of the nice guy you want to have, similar arguments I've heard about Pete Buttigieg, whereas that's all vibes, because at the core of it, both Crockett and Tallarico, there are a few issues where they are to the right of the National Party at any, and
No. Yeah, their
and
policies are almost the same, right?
that's sort of,
Stylistically, they were different. Yeah.
but this is Texas, right? And that to me is something, and again, having read your book, I was thinking about, it was just sort of, wow, this is Texas. They don't, I'm not saying that they're not real Texans or whatever. That's no such thing. And what do I know? I'm just sort of, but like on guns, on energy, on the things you think might be
on immigration.
Yeah. But they sound like National Democrats. And so, it just winds up being this sort of circle, because it's kind of like, well, if the national platform could flip Texas, then we would be flipping Texas, and hoo-hoo, and same with sort of all of these states. You, in your book, obviously you've worked in the Democratic Party, this kind of going back to Bernie Sanders, and I feel like a lot of things can be traced back to 2016. So if you can walk through this for a bit, because you talked about Obama's sort of moderation on certain issues, and how he was sort of able to thread the needle. But if I think about it, if you think of it, for a married couple, right, the Clintons, it does seem this huge shift from 1992, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bill Clinton, the governor of Arkansas, and where he stood on issues, his presentation, on that, and what the party was both when he came into power in 92, and then Hillary Clinton, especially by 2016, but even by 2008, she was a senator from New York. And arguably, one would argue that she was a senator from New York because even by that point, it was understood that she could not have won. She was first lady of Arkansas, but there was no way she would have won a statewide election there, right? So it was just sort of the party had shifted very clearly, like it was sort of a very sort of almost Rockefeller Republican style Democratic Party. And then that became sort of the big fight in 2016, right? Between Sanders and the Clinton wing, and sort of different from how Clinton ran in 2008. It seemed that she was sort of countering Sanders' more populist, class-based appeal, because in 2016 it was very little kind of overt approach to identity politics. He went on Joe Rogan and that sort of thing, and sort of she started to challenge that, and so the Democratic Party started to challenge that, specifically based on things like identity, and sort of
they started wielding identity politics
to challenge Sanders. And that, I don't, what are your thoughts on that? Because it seemed like that was sort of where the party really started to shift. They're starting to say things that I would never have heard Barack Obama say, like white privilege.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that there was some things though that kind of like led up to that though. For instance, Ferguson in 2014, right? I think that was in
Mm,
2014. So I think, people started having these ideas were sort of burgeoning on the left before that. But I definitely think seeing it weaponized in a political way, yes, I would say that the origins were not the progressive movement. It was not the Bernie Sanders movement in 2015, that's for sure. But I think, yeah, Hillary Clinton used identity and used her gender as a weapon against Bernie. And he did not lead an identity politics campaign, and he actually got some pushback internally from people like Pramila Jayapal, for instance, who for a long time was in charge of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and he was criticized internally by, I would say, particularly progressive women, that did not like that he did not take that approach in his politics and wanted him to lean more into the racial justice stuff. Um, and so I think that he took that. I think he was facing a lot of pressure, and I think that's part of the reason that he shifted between
mm,
2016 and 2020. And I also think that there was also with AOC becoming elected, and I think that she had she cared more about social justice and about identity politics than he did as well, and she really kind of became the new face of the movement. And then there was also some more insidery internal things happening, like the original founders of the Justice Democrats, which were more in line with the Bernie 2015 movement, were replaced and sort of pushed out, and a younger Latino woman took over the Justice Democrats, who I think is more in line with AOC as well and her priorities. And so I think it sort of all got pushed in this direction. And I think that's really why we saw this change happen. And I write in my book, even AOC, and I talk about this in chapter 7 of my book, ended up leaving her staff behind that helped get her elected. She demoted them, and it appeared to me as if she fired them essentially after having a conversation with Nancy Pelosi, because her staff had actually gone after a woman of color colleague of hers named Sharice Davids, while she had just entered office, her first 6 months of office. And so I kind of viewed it as a lot of people at that time thought that AOC had been co-opted by the Democratic establishment. I really felt like the Democratic establishment was also co-opted by the progressive wing of the party and by AOC specifically, in exchange for not doing as much of the populist stuff that Bernie had championed, and leading with a more of a colorblind class-based message. They really sort of championed more of AOC's ideas. And I think
mm.
you're even seeing that play out right now. Back in 2018, she and other squad members really popularized and really created the catchphrase, abolish ICE. And, just this past weekend, and back then there was only a handful of Democratic Congress people who would even say that. And nowadays, the DNC just voted over the weekend to make that official part of their party platform. So I think, we really have seen some of these ideas that have come from the AOC movement really become more mainstream in the Democratic Party. And I think that's part of the shift.
But wouldn't that have been, especially for the establishment at that time being run by Pelosi, or the leadership of Pelosi, was sort of, obviously we're not crazy about the populist stuff,
Yeah.
right?
No, they
But
weren't. And so it
but
was
but
easier
but
for
we
them.
will support this because
The
that's
social
how we
justice stuff. Yeah,
that
exactly.
because that's sort of the mix, and that's kind of like, if we talk about the quote unquote establishment Democratic Party now, like Jeffries, he speaks that language a lot, but he's all sort of anti-populist, pro-corporate, but at the same time, he'll say the social justice type stuff, or the language,
Exactly.
the academic language, which frankly is more alienating to people than the populist stuff. So it's kind of the worst of both worlds,
It's
I
the
would
worst of
argue.
both worlds. Yes.
With ICE, it's very interesting because INS has existed. There's a way to sort of say that ICE is a sort of because Republicans have been saying even that there were Republicans who had issues with the Patriot Act and sort of some of the things that happened with that, and they were able to sort of thread the needle of like, we oppose this while believing obviously we need to fight terrorism or whatever. But I think the problem is the Democratic Party perhaps has lost, I don't know, voter faith that you believe
Yes, they
for
absolutely
public
have.
safety. So then they could say, we obviously don't want an organization that could be weaponized to go into any state and execute citizens without control. But we also want to be able to support people, but we're going to
They have no
fundamentally change it.
credibility at this point on the issue of immigration at all. And I mean, and I know a lot of people might be listening and they're like, well, Biden tried to pass a law that, would have shut down the border, but, Donald Trump told Mike Johnson not to do it and blah, blah, blah. And it's just like, okay, well, that argument kind of goes out the window when there hasn't been any legislation that has really been passed and the border has still been shut down. It gave amnesty to anyone that claimed it, and a lot of those people were not true, or not amnesty, but asylum. And and a lot of those people were not true asylum seekers, they were economic migrants. And I think that has been the disconnect for working class people, is that Democrats still won't even recognize that a surplus of people that are non-college educated, lower wage workers does actually impact the wages of working class people and does make them feel like they are being that they are having unfair competition for a lot of the jobs that are left, especially in these places like in Ohio and Missouri and Michigan, where the good paying non-college non-degree jobs like manufacturing have largely been shipped overseas. And so what is left for people to that don't have college degrees in those places, and then people that do have more specialized skills. My uncle, I like to talk about him as an example. His union actually has had to consult on construction projects that were where there was a large immigrant labor force that was actually getting the work, but they were just getting the consulting job, which obviously is a lot shorter and doesn't it's not it's they would have rather have had the years long work of being to actually build those projects as well. So especially in industries like construction, it really does undermine wages and creates all of this extra competition for jobs that creates a lot of resentment.
And Sanders had said things similar prior to, which again
Yeah, it
was
used to be the
controversial.
progressive position,
Um,
and now
and
it's not.
back to what you were saying about Biden, I think it was read as sort of a desperate move based on political backlash. He was trying to pass this, and there were obviously had some issues with the bill, but of course Trump's going to try to stop it. And I wrote at the time, like, if you had a Republican president who was getting hammered on an issue that Democrats were winning on, let's say abortion rights or whatever, and
They would do the same thing.
you're like 6 months within the election, and it's like, okay, well, this issue, if you don't pass a sort of, kind of conservative but ultimately moderate for you abortion bill, you're going to lose, and then we can come in and pass the one that we want to do. Of course we're going to like not let you pass the bill. Like, why? Of course.
Right.
So the
Yeah.
argument would be like, if you wanted to sort of address this, it should have been done earlier, or to not do the things that kind of led to
That
this
you
issue.
did, which is allowing anybody to claim asylum.
Yeah,
It's just, it's
and
crazy.
there's kind of debates about it. To me, it's sort of beyond the moral issue. You've got to figure out, and this is something that the party has struggled with, which is sort of the political aspect of it. And what I see online is that it's either they blame voters for being too dumb to understand or being too racist or whatever. And I think this goes into what we'll talk about in part two, which is
That's
sort
what
of this
happened
religious.
last night. I was on believe it or not, I did a radio show last night, and I was on a radio show with Nancy Pelosi's daughter, Christine Pelosi. And I actually like challenged her on the fact that the DNC just passed abolish ICE. And her answer was that, well, the voters just hear that, they don't really understand the full degree of what we're saying or what we're actually trying to do, and it doesn't mean that we don't. And she was basically blaming the voters for not being educated enough about the topic.
I
Which,
just
but
I
while
don't
at the same
yeah.
time acknowledging that a lot of people, especially working class people, don't want to abolish ICE. So it was a very strange and interesting conversation.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't support ICE at the end of the day, but also like why
But you
can't
can
we
talk about reforming
oh
ICE. You can,
why can't we end it like Doge? So it's like when I talk about how Republicans operate, no
yeah,
Republican I don't think Trump they were sort of resisting the idea about a lot of the Project 2025 stuff. It's like, what? Oh no, we're not gonna do this wild, crazy stuff because no one runs on wild, crazy stuff.
right. And then,
That only
yeah,
really pleases that really only pleases activists. So generally you kind of go in and you say, we're going to reform or we're going, I mean, that's what Musk was saying, right? Like a lot of the stuff's like, we're going to get rid of waste. And the next thing you know, like, oh, a foreign aid
right.
has got it. So you could do the
Or
same
like we're
thing.
not going to cut Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security, but then we do cut Medicaid.
You just use
Yeah,
terms
that's
like
what they did.
you'd
Yeah.
use terms like reform and whatever, and then you get in the power and then you do it and then you get away with
I
it.
personally still think it'd be a mistake though if they got into power and then just went hard left on immigration and did a bunch of, I think it would be, and you may not
Well,
agree with me, but I really think that they need to take it more seriously. I think it's a huge
yeah.
blind spot for them.
Um,
Um,
well, I think
the issue
not
of immigration.
doing what Trump has been doing is not going to essentially I think he's actually done a lot of disservice to immigration. Like Republicans have lost ground on immigration
Yeah, with
issue because no one likes seeing, and
the
so it makes
surge.
it look like you're going to do a purge. We're taking away the people who are nonviolent. Like do what you could do what Obama was doing, and you can kind of essentially secure the border while
Well, Obama
also
deported people that were just here illegally too. They weren't
yeah,
just all violent
yes,
criminals.
but there was no, I mean, we weren't seeing what we're seeing
Yeah,
now.
but I'll push back a little. Part of that is because there weren't sanctuary cities then. The local blue governments were actually willing to work with the federal authorities on deporting people. And because it's Donald Trump, they won't.
Mhm. Well,
And I think that is the right's the argument when they go back to like, okay, well, you want to abolish ICE? Well, how do we actually deport people if none of these blue cities are willing to work with us?
well, I think that is the debate, which is just sort of you can have the debate about sanctuary cities. You can have the debate. I think the idea is like we're not that no one wants to see what we're seeing now.
No, no,
Like
I don't. I
getting rid
spoke
of
out
sanctuary cities
when
is getting
Alex Preddy died. I spoke out against that. I mean,
yeah.
it was horrific. Like and so no, it's like you don't. And I think you're right. I think there has been a backlash to all of that, and I don't think that do think they did a disservice to their cause. But I think things have calmed down. I mean, we're not seeing a surge as much anymore, but yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna like defend it when it really upset me too. But at the
Yeah.
same time, I just think that Democrats tend to react like in this very reflexive way that can sometimes come back to haunt them later in elections, and especially regaining ground with working class people. And just as I think the right's biggest blind spot is healthcare, I think that the Democratic Party's biggest blind spot is immigration. And so it's just troubling to see.
But that's been since 2016 because Trump was sort of he spoke about it in such a racist way, and it was a shift. But he was embracing arguably a more populist bent about immigration, about people coming in. But he was saying it in such a way that Democrats, as you say, might have lived on. But then he made up presumptions at the time that he's saying these terrible things about immigration. That means that obviously we're going to win Florida forever and we're going to win Texas. And that wasn't true because a lot of, frankly, working class Latinos who had gotten was like, well, we actually aren't crazy about legal immigration either, which I
Right.
think goes into what we said about the kind of the staffer class, like who's informing
Right.
their sort of views of everything. And I think part of it, and we talked about, you know, uh, Pelosi or AOC and their differences, but ultimately college educated women regardless of how different they are. And I think there's been in the party, it's very controversial if you ever state that, but it's a party that it seems to often have kind of the views and perspectives and agenda of sort of college educated women, particularly college educated white
Yeah.
women. And there's such a huge, I would think of any group, and I don't think we can kind of get into why that is, but it's true of any group, um, non-college educated white women and college educated, there's a vast difference.
Huge difference.
And I think the party is often, does not acknowledge it. So sort of they will speak about issues that are important to women, but it's really women
that
who
are quite comfortable. Yeah. Exactly. These are the debates that I would get into with actually white women with college degrees last election in 2024. I would be talking to other moms, and they would just be like, "Oh my gosh, abortion! Like it's so bad what the GOP has done, and like there's no way that Kamala is going to lose because there's going to be this huge backlash to abortion." And at the same time, I'd be talking to my mom and grandmother who don't have college degrees and are white women, and they were like, "We don't care about abortion. That's not what we're thinking about at all. We're thinking about the fact that we can't pay our rent or that we can't afford groceries." And so, yes, there's like this profound disconnect that really, really frustrates me. And I don't know really how they get past it, Stephen.
Well, I just remember the infamous Kamala Harris ad. It was a narration for, I believe, Julia Roberts, and it was imagining these white suburban women secretly voting for Kamala Harris because their only reason they
Oh my
weren't
God.
was because the mean men in their lives. So they were trying to and then they had the male version of it where the dude bros are going and the one guy goes and secretly votes for Kamala because it doesn't let his bros and the MAGA hats know. And it was such a flip.
Democrats wonder why they lost men.
Yeah, and it's such a flip.
So funny.
But it's like a flip of what was really happening if you actually talk to people. And again, we've seen it. And again, going back to 2016, you're more likely to have women, especially not even just working class women, white working class women, but even college educated women who had issues especially in I've seen this in Portland where I live, and others who had issues with public safety or whatever. They felt they could not socially. So they were doing the reverse of that ad. They were like, I can't socially admit to voting for even a Republican, not just Trump, but a Republican.
Yeah.
So I will say the appropriate stuff out loud.
Very socially easy to admit you're supporting Kamala Harris. Very not socially easy to admit you were voting for Trump, or even not voting, to be honest with you.
But yeah, so there was like that ad to me reflected sort of a disconnect from what was really happening on the ground. And like, wow, if you think that's the issue, is that white women who want to vote for Harris feel so like funny. They can't. And like, that was something, a true disconnect. And I think that goes into kind of, we'll can talk about this more in part 2, what I call sort of the kind of cultural disconnect the party has been having in its sort of refusal to acknowledge what's happening. And I've always, again, likened it to sort of cult-like issues as well. So tune in next week for that.
Nothing Left, Confessions of a Democratic Operative, New York Times bestseller, available on Amazon or wherever books are sold.
Wonderful. Thank you, Evan.